Okay. I'd like to start with a few introductory points, just to get us going. As many of you know, there are many different kinds of neuroprosthetic devices or neural implants that are already being used today to restore functionality to damaged human bodies. For example, we have sensory neuroprosthetics that provide sensory input to the brain. These include things like artificial retinas. This is an image of an artificial retina as it exists today. We also have motor neuroprosthetics that receive commands from the brain and allow someone, for example, to control a computer by thought. We also have bidirectional sensor motor neuroprosthetics that do both. They allow you to send instructions from your brain to control a mechanical device, electronic device, and they allow you to receive sense data from that device so that you can sense your environment. And now scientists and engineers are developing the first cognitive neuroprosthetics that allow the manipulation of internal cognitive processes, things like memory, emotion, or volition, and these are in the earliest experimental stages. So by considering the path that the actual scientific and technological advances are expected to follow, and drawing on the insights of science fiction creators, game designers, and futurologists, we can explore today the implications of one potential aspect of such future technologies. So let's consider the ramifications of this possibility. This is a screenshot from Ghost in the Shell. Basically imagine what if the entire brain of an adult human could be transplanted into a sort of neuroprosthetic casing that possesses life support functions, input-output ports, to create something called a cyber brain. So basically you have a human brain in this sort of case that keeps it alive. And such a cyber brain could potentially then be swapped into different robotic bodies to allow its owner's mind to sense and interact with the environment. We can refer to a robotic body that's capable of hosting that sort of cyber brain as a cyber shell. So inside here you have a live human brain of some adult being inserted into a robotic body that, to which you can hook up the sensory inputs, the motor outputs, and the brain can interact with that body. Already, researchers are developing cybernetic device ontologies and typologies for those sorts of neuroprosthetics to help us think ahead, to understand the implications that they would have for fields like ethics, management of human organizations, and information security. And that's what a lot of my research relates to. I don't want to bog things down too much with definitions, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the fact that we can classify these kinds of neuroprosthetics in different ways, and science fiction role-playing games are excellent at this, that especially cyberpunk tabletop role-playing games will have books that sort of explore and define these different kinds of categories. So you could think about all of the different kinds of future neuroprosthetics that would give you an artificial body, whether it's a physical artificial body or it could just be a virtual experience that's artificial. So we could group all of those together and call those allosomatic neuroprosthetics that are giving you an artificial body. But those could be very human-like bodies. So we would want another concept to describe the body that you would be given that would be radically non-human. So we could group those together as ones being enabled by xenosomatic neuroprosthetics. And then if you want to classify things according to whether it's physical or virtual, you could think of a neosomatic prosthetic as one that physically replaces your body. So it puts your brain into a new physical shell. Or a dosisomatic prosthetic that just gives you the experience of having this new body, but you still possess your old body. It could be lying in a tube someplace. So these technologies all are involved with transforming or replacing the natural human body, but in different ways. And We'll mostly talk about the ones that are neosomatic or xenosomatic, but what we're talking about will apply to the other types as well, for the most part. So, imagine again that in the future, a human brain can be encased in that sort of protective life support system and then placed into a robotic shell of some sort. Does that need to be a human-like shell or a human-like body? Would it be possible, as many works of science fiction have envisioned, for a human brain in this sort of casing to be put into some kind of cyborg body that is radically non-human? So, in other words, could you imagine a human brain adapting to a cybernetic body that looks like this? This again is from Ghost in the Shell. So you could just try to imagine for a moment if today your brain were put in this protective casing and you have now been put inside this. So this is your new body, and it's about this tall. It can roll around on the floor. What would that be like, having these limbs, these sensors? Can you imagine in any way what that might be like? Or could you imagine having a body like this? This is from GURPS Transhuman Space. This is a cyber shell that can be used for undersea work. Or could you imagine being put in a robotic body like this? So try to imagine for a moment what that would be like if your brain is in here, and beneath you you have all of these robotic tentacles that are feeling things that you're trying to move. What would that be like? Would that be possible for a mind to deal with? Or could you even imagine being in a body like this sort of floating robotic octopus? Or what if you had a cybernetic body that was the size of an entire city? Or why not? Why couldn't you have a body that is connected to millions of sensors and manipulators spread throughout a city? You could have 3D printers hooked up to you, so just by thinking you could will something into existence, just print it out of one of the 3D printers scattered throughout this city, which is your body. Or could you imagine having a body which is even the size of an entire planet that is feeding sense data into your mind and which you are controlling? Or another possibility, this is from the role-playing game Eclipse phase. Could you imagine that your cyber brain is linked to this body of millions of tiny nanobots that you can control and receive sense data from? Or can you imagine having a body whose form is so radically non-human that it is even difficult to describe? And these kinds of possibilities may not be possible if we're talking about physically replacing your body with this sort of structure, but if you are floating in a tube someplace and neuroprosthetics are providing you with all of these sensory experiences, could you have the experience of having this sort of body, some sort of floating cloud of lightning, or a body that's something like this? Can we even imagine what that would be like? Or a body that's something like this sort of fractal cloud. So can a human mind inhabit a non-human body through neuroprosthetics? And that's basically the question we're going to look at today, and it relates to video games in at least 3 ways. First, I'll argue that the game world's mechanics and storylines of existing video games reflect game designers' insights into the transformability of the human body. Second, I'll argue playing video games allows us to learn the limits of what is possible regarding body transformation and substitution. And third, I'll argue that by playing video games, we are actually practicing a form of shape-shifting, that we are undertaking a process of cyberization in which we augment and replace our natural bodies with potentially non-human cybernetic bodies. So first I want to look at something called body schema. And as you know, the questions about the relationship between mind and body are ancient and are still unresolved. Aristotle in places seemed to argue, for example, that a soul could not change bodies because the soul basically was the pattern of organization within a particular body. So it wouldn't even make sense to talk about that shifting to a different body. But in other places, he seemed to argue that the human intellect can exist separate from the body. So there are different interpretations. St. Thomas Aquinas argued that the human soul can exist separate from the body, for example, after death. But that even after the soul has departed from the body, it still yearns to reconnect with it in the resurrection. So you end up with a sort of image like this, that the soul can leave the body, but it's always yearning for it, to reconnect with it. Descartes imagined that you have an immaterial spiritual mind and this material physical body, two completely different things, and that somehow the two are able to interact causally through the pineal gland in the brain. That this part of the brain could somehow communicate with something that the soul, the mind, is completely immaterial. And in that model, you can imagine the mind as this sort of tiny spectral driver who's steering the vehicle that is the human body. That became known as the Homunculus Argument, from the Latin word for little man. It's basically like you have this little man steering what's happening in your body. And of course then more recent philosophers like Merleau-Ponty have both drawn on and critiqued that kind of Cartesian dualism to look at the relationship between mind and body. And we also have classic literary explorations of the relationship between mind and body, and the possibility of radical body transformation, such as, for example, Kafka's Metamorphosis. On the scientific side, there was a major advance in the 1950s when Wilder Penfield discovered that basically you can map parts of the brain that communicate with different parts of the body. You can map the locations where the parts of the brain that are sending and receiving information to different parts of the body. And that mapping became known as the Cortical Homunculus. So basically this is a diagram, cross-section of the brain, and an artist has overlaid which parts of the brain are sending and receiving information to which parts of the body. And some scientists and artists have tried to prepare 3D representations of the cortical homunculus, like this, for example. And basically what this is representing is, you can see the hands are giant and the feet are tiny. That reflects the fact that the amount of space in the brain that's dedicated to communicating with the hands is huge in comparison to the amount of space in the brain that's dedicated to communicating with the feet. The reason why the eyes are so small is because this is dealing with somatosensory communication, or the sense of touch, not the actual visual data. Otherwise, the eyes would be much larger. However, that cortical homunculus, that understanding, is basically like this sort of diagram of in-out ports on the back of your computer, that it shows the physical structure of where data is coming in and out from the brain and moving from the brain to the body. But it doesn't explain how the mind is able to interpret and understand the sensory experience that it receives from the body, nor how the mind knows how to control the body. So, if I want to raise my right hand, when I will that, why is it that it's not my left hand that goes up? Why is it that I can make just my right hand rise up in the air? Or if I feel someone tapping, how do I know? Well, somebody's tapping on my right hand, and I can tell that even if I have my eyes closed. So how does the mind do that? And that's a question not of the hardware of where input and output is coming from, but that's the software. What's the software that is being continuously run by the mind, the part of our operating system that allows us to understand and to manipulate our environment through the mediation of our body. And a key part of that software that allows the mind to sense and control the body is known as the body schema, the idea that was developed by Henry Head. And basically, you could think of the body schema as the mind's own internal model or representation of your body. The body schema serves as a sort of translator. It allows you to synthesize all of this sensory data that you're getting in order to understand the position and configuration of your body. And it allows the mind to distinguish between the body and the surrounding environment. It lets you know where does your body stop and an external object start. It also lets the mind understand how a particular act of will cause your body to move or to change in a particular way, and how that will affect your environment. So it's very important. The body schema is what makes it possible for us to do things like walk, run, swim, jump. Even in the dark, even with our eyes closed, we're still able to do those things. To catch or dodge an object that's thrown at us, to write, to type, to play a musical instrument, to use a controller to play a video game. So the body schema is this translator that's translating our will into specific body motions, and is translating particular sensations into the awareness that I just felt something in this part of my body. And through decades of research, psychologists and others have discovered a lot of important facts about the body schema and how it works. For example, each person has a different body schema because each of us possesses a body with different physical characteristics that we have used in different ways over our lifetime. Another fact is that our body schema affects, but is different from our body image. That your body image is your feeling about the physical characteristics and attractiveness of your body. The body schema is more about the actual objective sensory perceptions and motor control of your body. Some researchers do think that problems with the body schema can, for example, contribute to some eating disorders, because there may be some people who are unable to correctly sense and interpret characteristics about their body. Another fact is that the body schema displays a certain degree of plasticity. In other words, it can change in order to adapt to changes in our body. So, for example, the body schema changes gradually over time as our body grows and develops. Here are two different people. Their minds have very different body schemas because their bodies have very different structures and capacities. In addition to changing gradually as we grow so that our mind can adapt to our evolving body, our body schema can also change more rapidly. For example, if the body is suddenly injured, if we lose a limb in an accident. But the body schema may never completely adapt to our new body. So there are phenomena like phantom limb pain, where if someone has lost a leg, even though they no longer have the leg, they may continue to feel the sensation of having the leg. They may experience pain and different sensations as though the leg was still there. And one thing that often happens with the body schema over time is, for example, if someone loses part of their arm, their body schema will, at first they will still feel as though the entire arm were there. Over time, it will feel to them as though the arm has become shorter and shorter, and eventually it may feel as though they have a hand, but it's now attached directly to their elbow. That their mind is trying to adjust to this new body, but it can't do so perfectly. Another fact is that our body schema can update itself to incorporate new body parts into our body. And psychologists did something called the rubber hand illusion, and there have been many different variations. Basically, this woman is the subject of the experiment. This is her real hand, but she can't see it because this is opaque. This is a rubber hand. And basically what happens is the experimenter taps on this rubber hand, and the subject can see the person tapping on their hand. And at the same time, every time that the experimenter taps on this hand, they're also tapping on the real hand without the subject knowing it. And if you do that enough, because she's actually feeling the tapping, her brain becomes trained so that then you can only tap on the rubber hand. You don't even have to tap on the real hand anymore, and she'll still feel a sensation as though someone were tapping on this hand, which is made of rubber and is not actually part of her body, but her body schema has expanded to incorporate this rubber hand into her body. So the mind feels as though this is part of her body. Another variation is the mind can update its body schema to incorporate, to some extent, duplicate limbs. So one of these is a real hand, one of these is a rubber hand. Again, by training, the brain will eventually update its understanding to believe that both of these are part of the person's body. Another thing which is very important when we get to thinking about video games and cybernetics is if we use a particular tool often enough, our mind can update and extend its body schema to incorporate that tool into our body. So from the perspective of our mind, it is as though that object is a part of our body. It's no longer a foreign object, it is a part of us. So, for example, here is a tennis player. And if you look at him, where is his attention? He's looking at the ball. He doesn't have to look at the tennis racket. He's probably spent so many thousands of hours practicing that his mind has actually changed its body schema so that it now considers the tennis racket to be a part of his body. Another example of that is there's a kind of fishing called trolling, where basically you're in this boat and the boat is moving over the surface of a lake, and you have a line that's going down into the water, and at the end of the line there's a little fishing lure, and as the boat moves, the lure is bouncing over the bottom of the lake. So this is sort of a depiction of that. You know, you have the lure, it's bouncing along the bottom as the boat's moving along. Well, what are you actually feeling when you're doing that kind of fishing? You're holding the fishing rod, and what you literally are feeling are these tiny sensations of movement in your hand as the fishing line pulls a little harder, or there's a slack in the line. So you're feeling these slight motions in your hand. But what is your brain experiencing? What your brain is experiencing, if you've done this enough, is it actually feels to you as though your arm were extended 50 meters down through the fishing line, and you're actually dragging your hand along the bottom of the lake, and you're feeling the bottom of the lake. You can feel that was a wooden tree stump, that was a turtle, that was some seaweed, that your body schema has expanded to make that whole system of the fishing line part of your body. Another example that many people will be familiar with is that of driving an automobile. That if you drive a car enough, your body schema will expand to incorporate that tool, that vehicle, into your body. So that if you are familiar enough with the car, you've driven it enough, if your front left tire drives over a rock, what is it you literally experience? So you literally experience your hands moving a little from the steering wheel, you experience a little pressure on your rear end and your feet, from the car moving slightly. But what does your mind actually experience? Your mind doesn't experience your fingers moving or your feet moving. What your mind experiences is my front left wheel just rolled over a rock. That's what it feels like, that your mind has expanded its body schema to make that entire car part of your body. Another fact is that robots also utilize body schemas. That robots can learn how their bodies work through something called motor babbling. And this is a robot that was trying to learn on its own how to flip a pancake. And basically, one way that robots can learn how to control their bodies, they just start stimulating actuators at random and see what happens. And at first, it won't be very successful. It may not accomplish what the robot wants, but over time, it will learn that if I have this decision, this act of will, this stimulation, this is the result that will happen in my body, and this is the impact that will have on the world. So and this in some ways is how infants also learn, to understand their bodies, to control the environment and sense the environment. It did eventually figure it out after they hooked up some sort of fancy motion capture system. So let's consider a hypothetical example of how our body schema would impact the use of mono-cybernetic prosthetic. That was the kind like the cyber brain in a suitcase. So you put your brain in this case, and it can be swapped into any kind of robot body, a cyber shell. So let's imagine that neuroprosthetic technology allows us to take a live brain from an adult, and this is the body schema in the brain. So this is a person who's grown up as a human being with this body, so they have the body schema to match their body. So what if we were to take that brain and put it into this cybernetic housing? So it's still alive, it's doing well, but it no longer has its natural human body. Well, that cyber brain could be inserted into a robotic cyber shell based on a human body. I put the brain in the torso rather than the head, just to emphasize this is now a robotic body. This is not a natural human, but this form still has human-like eyes, human-like ears, human-like limbs. So that all of this, and those inputs have been hooked up to the cyber brain, so that basically the experience, the sensory experience, the motor experience is still the same. So this mind would not need to update its body schema in order to be able to understand sense data and to control this new body. But now imagine that that cyber brain, instead of being put in a familiar human shell, were inserted into some radically non-human cyborg body. So here, for example, we have a giant robot crab. You can imagine the cyber brain being put into a robot crab. Well, the person's mind still has the body schema developed through years of experience of having a human body. It still has that body schema of his or her old human body. So it's probably an understatement to say that at least initially the mind would likely have major problems interpreting sense data from this new universe of crab antennae and eyes and whatever other sensors crabs have, robot crabs. And you would probably have no chance of being able to control all of these extra limbs. But given the fact that the brain and the body schema does have some plasticity, might the mind eventually be able to update its body schema so that now it can understand and manipulate this robotic crab body? So to look at different kinds of bodies, if you're going to take a cyber brain and put it into a robotic shell, why limit yourself to a humanoid body? Why not try something different? Well, what qualitatively different kinds of bodies are there? And we can look at what biology says about that. One way of categorizing bodies from a biological perspective is according to their symmetry. So for example, you have spherically symmetrical bodies. Wherever, this is a kind of algae volvox. Wherever you slice it, you get two identical halves. What are spherical bodies good for? Spherical bodies are great if you are an organism that floats, that rolls aimlessly. You have no power to move, you just float. For that kind of organism, there's no up, there's no down, no forward or back. Direction has no meaning. The next kind of body is a radially symmetrical body. If you look from the top, it looks symmetrical. But if you look from the side, you can see, well, it does have a distinct top and bottom. And these kinds of bodies, radially symmetrical, where do we find them? They're often found in organisms that are either anchored in one spot or that float, and for which up and down do have some meaning. So in the case of a sea anemone, you do care about the difference between up and down because down is a rock, that's all that there is. Up is food. There's all of this food floating above you. So you do care about up and down, but you're not moving. The third kind is a bilaterally symmetrical body. This is what human beings have. This is what mice have. Here you have not only a clear top and bottom, but also a distinct front and back. And these kinds of bodies, what are they good for? These are found in animals that are able to move under their own power, over a surface, in a straight line to get someplace, in a specific direction. So, if we think about this, if, for example, if your cyber brain had been put into a form which is going to be a military battlefield cyborg, you need to be able to fire, to move in a particular direction, you might prefer to have a bilaterally symmetrical body, because you need to get someplace fast. That's the kind of body that would make sense for that. A human mind could potentially develop a new body schema for that sort of body without too much difficulty, relatively speaking. On the other hand, what if you are existing virtually? You're hooked up to a neuroprosthetic that's giving you this virtual experience. It could be temporary, it could be for the rest of your life. That you're existing in a 3D cyberspace in which there is no gravity. Because this in state is all being presented by a computer that's processing everything, so it can have whatever laws of physics the programmer wants. So if you're in a 3D cyberspace with no gravity, no up or down, you might want to possess a spherical body, because it could provide you with simultaneous sensory input from every direction. So sort of like this sort of hemispherical image that you can get from a fisheye lens. But just imagine if you were receiving, that you could see in every direction all at once. So your field of vision would have no center. You would have no front, no back, no sides. You would be experiencing everything equally. You would be focused on everything. And if you wanted to move, you could move in any direction with equal ease. You wouldn't have to reorient yourself because you're already facing in every direction simultaneously. So for a cyberspace of some kinds, this may be the kind of body you would want. But you can see how, in comparison to the Naga cyborg, this would be pretty difficult for a human mind to develop a body schema for this sort of form. So what are the limits of what is biologically, psychologically, neurocybernetically possible? Could you have a body like this, for example, and being able to understand the world and manipulate the world through a body like that? How radically can our body be transformed through neuroprosthetics before our mind loses the ability to stretch our body schema any further? So at what point would you just go insane, or would you become trapped in a body that you can't understand and can't control? Game designers, I think, have some insights into the plasticity of our mind's body schema. And I want to contrast anecdotally, and I haven't done a detailed empirical study of all of the games in which body transformation occurs. So I'll be very interested to get your feedback, both from the scientific and theoretical perspective as to whether you agree or disagree, and also from your experiences as gamers, of your experience of games that you might have. But I want to contrast two different games just as examples. One, a fantasy-themed computer game, and another, a science-fiction-themed computer game, and how they handle body transformation. The first example is a fantasy game called Daisan the Shapeshifter, also known as Dungeon Gate. This is a fantasy game in which your character has the magical ability to shapeshift into the physical form and use the abilities of any character that he has seen in the game, including animals. And he's not just creating an illusion, he can actually transform his body into these different forms. So this is what Daisan normally looks like. This is his normal human form. Apparently one day he met a big warrior who was carrying a giant mace, because now Daisan, when he wants, can produce a puff of lightning, and instantly he transforms into this warrior shape. And he actually possesses the strength, all the physical form of that warrior. Apparently, Dyson also met a giant, terrifying spider because he can produce a flash of light and shapeshift into a spider. He also encountered a horse. He can now shapeshift into a horse. He encountered a rabbit. He can shapeshift into a rabbit. He can change into a mouse with a flash of light. He can change into a beetle. He can change into a different kind of beetle. So what is the logic of shapeshifting in this fantasy game? Basically, after shapeshifting into a giant beetle for the first time, you instantly know how to interpret all of the sense data that you're getting from your beetle antennae and beetle eyes, and you instantly know how to control all of your beetle limbs. Not just to move exactly where you want to go, but you can even sort of attack enemies instantly. Not only are you able to move effectively after shapeshifting into chicken form, but you are able to defeat other real chickens in a chicken race. So that's a fantasy game. And we can contrast that with one example of the game with science fiction elements, Command & Conquer 4. In this game, some of the characters have taken on non-human forms, not as a result of magic, but through the use of technology and cybernetic augmentation. So you have characters like the Nod Reaper, which is essentially a human brain in a cyborg body that includes 4 legs rather than 2. This is a fan fiction art depiction. And I want to quote from the Wikia page describing the in-game history of how these beings came about within the world of the game. It says, chosen mutants were cybernetically linked to a spider-legged chassis, controlled via a link tapped directly into the cerebral cortex of the subject. This weapon was still unfinished. Non-scientists were unable to solve problems of controlling 4 additional limbs through the neural interface. Mutants were inevitably suffering catastrophic mental and physical damage. Most were reduced to a state of incoherent screaming madness, while those that didn't could not operate their limbs with any form of accuracy. The issue was simple. Biofeedback from double the standard amount of legs was too much for the operators to handle, resulting in Reaper candidates crashing into walls or through them, at war with their own limbs or overwhelming the cerebral cortex to the point of brain death. So you can see how that depiction is very different, a depiction of body transformation. Can we draw any conclusions about game designers' implicit insights into the flexibility of our real body schema by comparing this fantasy game, Dyson the Shapeshifter, with a science fiction game? And again, I'm just suggesting this anecdotally. I haven't studied all games, but I'd be curious to see what your feedback is. But I would suggest that game designers implicitly realize that in the real world, in which the laws of physics and biology do apply, represented by the world of science fiction games, updating our body schema is hard. It takes a long time, and it may not even work, because these games are trying to capture the actual scientific realities. If a game that is supposed to be hard science fiction shows characters having their brain instantly dropped into the body of a robotic dragon or spider, and instantly they know how to expertly manipulate it, a player might get a sense that that seems a little odd. Is that really believable? In a hard science fiction game, that might raise questions. On the other hand, there is nothing unreasonable or inappropriate about depicting instant adaptation to radically non-human bodies in a fantasy game. Because typically, in those games, shape-shifting is occurring as a result of magic that already violates the laws of biology and physics that are binding in our real world. And I would suggest the game Shadowrun Returns Dragonfall encapsulates these principles pretty well, because on the one hand, the Shadowrun universe does possess hard cyberpunk science fiction aspects that strive to realistically reflect how difficult it is to change one's body schema. For example, in the Shadowrun games, the more parts of your natural body that you replace with cybernetics, the more that you experience something called essence loss. You're losing some part of your soul, some part of your human essence. And your body schema can only be stretched so far before your mind breaks down. So if you replace too many of your body parts with cybernetics, in a Shadowrun game, when your essence gets reduced to 0, you die. Or, at least, you should die. But Shadowrun is also a game with strong fantasy elements. So, in some of these games you have, like the cyber zombie from Shadowrun Returns to Dragonfall, you can have characters whose bodies have been so augmented that they should be dead, because everything that science and biology tells us is that there's no way their mind could have adapted to that, but they can be kept alive anyway through the use of magic. And I would just throw the question out there, could we contrast the way that Shadowrun handles that, which I think coherently incorporates both the science fiction and fantasy understanding of body schema transformation, with some superhero-themed games in which magic and technology are sometimes mixed together in a way that can seem indiscriminate, ad hoc, and lacking any sort of coherent conceptual framework. And that's not necessarily a criticism of superhero games, but in some superhero games you may have characters in the game that were created over a period of decades by different authors. So you could have one character who has the ability to shapeshift because they were given that magical power by ancient Aztec deities, and you could have another character who has the ability to shapeshift as a result of the popular radioactive laboratory accident. So, now we can look at exploring the limits of body schema reengineering through computer gaming. What is there to prevent a human brain from being dropped into a body like this? Why couldn't that happen? Or for a human brain to have a body like that of Dr. Octopus from the Spider-Man game? Or why couldn't a human mind utilize a body like these? This is more fan fiction from Command and Conquer. Or why couldn't a human mind have a body that's even the size and complexity of an entire city or an entire planet? Why couldn't that be the case? Well, we already know that there are significant limits to how far the human mind's body schema can be stretched before things go wrong. Simmel talked about, a century ago, about sensory overload that can come from living in a big city. Imagine the kind of sensory overload that you would experience if you had thousands or millions of sense organs scattered in space presenting you with all of this data. Could a mind handle that? The cyberneticist Ross Ashby formulated something called the law of requisite variety. And basically what it says is that if you have a control unit controlling some system, the control unit must have at least as much complexity as the system that it's controlling, because the control unit needs to be able to create an internal model of the system that it's managing. So the human brain has a certain degree of complexity. So that probably gives us a limit, because the brain would not be able to manage a system that exceeds a certain level of complexity, however that ends up being defined. So that would put another limit on what kinds of bodies we can control. Another thing that roboticists deal with, for example, is just the simple thing of constructing a limb. The more joints that you put into a limb, the more degrees of freedom it has, the more cognitive processing power you need just to move the limb, to move the end of the limb to where you want it to go. So this robot arm only has 2 degrees of freedom. This one has 6. So that's incredibly complex to figure out how to control all of those variables to get the arm to move where you want it to. The human arm has 6 or 7 degrees of freedom. An octopus, you could think of a tentacle as essentially a limb with an infinite number of joints, and the octopus has 8 of those. The brain of an octopus does not have enough. Look at its limbs. The octopus isn't actually controlling all of the actions of its limbs. But the octopus, because its brain doesn't have that much capacity, I stopped the video. The video was called Feeding My Octopus. We're going to imagine it says, playing with my friend the hermit crab. I think I cut it off before the hermit crab vanishes. The brain of an octopus can't control all of those tentacles and move them at once. So basically, what the octopus brain does is it gives the arms a general goal. It says, I want to grab that. And then the octopus sits back and watches to see how the arms decide to collaborate in order to accomplish that goal. That the arms have some degree of cognitive processing power of their own. And that's why if octopus arms are cut off, they can, for a time, continue to react, move away from danger, that sort of thing. Artificial tentacles are being developed as a part of soft robotics. This is an artificial tentacle that uses polymers instead of electrical actuators. Okay, so you may be able to build a robotic body with tentacles, but considering how hard it is for an octopus to control tentacles, how realistic is it to imagine a human brain being able to use its body schema to control some robot body with a bunch of tentacles? Another limitation, when the video game Descent came out years ago, numerous reviewers complained about the fact that they became nauseous, they became sick from playing the game, because it's so easily, the controller so easily allowed it to spin around in a way that was completely physically disoriented. If it's difficult for our brain to even adapt to that sort of body, is it likely to imagine our brain controlling a city or a planet? So we have a general awareness that there are these limitations regarding how far our mind's body schema can be stretched before problems arise. But where do those boundaries lie? Is there a way for us to try on new non-human bodies by augmenting or replacing our natural sensory and motor organs with different ones? And I would argue that yes, there is a way through video games. And I would suggest that playing a video game transforms and re-engineers our body schema in a unique and powerful way that does not occur when we experience books, films, tabletop role-playing games. Again, this is not a criticism of any of those, but to say that there is something unique about the experience of playing a video game, which is more like the experience of driving a car. Because only video games create an instantaneous, real-time, bidirectional biocybernetic feedback loop between our mind and a virtual environment, which we sense and manipulate by means of our new cybernetic game body, which the game provides. So the video game system, here you have someone playing a video game. The video game system, he decides he wants to do something in the game world. His brain sends commands to his hand. His hand immediately reacts. The video game system instantaneously detects that input, and as a result, the game world is transformed. That the cybernetic body, the game body possessed by the player, has some impact in the world. The game world is transformed. And instantly, sense data is sent to the brain of the player to show them how that action, that act of will that they just undertook, has transformed this virtual world through the use of the cyber body that they possess there. That this is an incredibly powerful cycle because it's instantaneous. And you can imagine this going on continuously with someone who's playing a video game for hours, weeks, that if we spend enough time inhabiting the cybernetic game body that a video game provides, our mind transforms its body schema to take this new body as our own. And that's really not that radical or startling an idea, because we already know that that happens with things like automobiles, with all sorts of other tools that we use, that we incorporate those into our body schema. Even a simple walking simulator game changes our body schema, because we grew up, what did we grow up learning? We grew up learning that in order to walk, you have to send commands to your legs, that this is how you walk, by willing your legs to move. But when you play this game, what does your mind learn? Your mind learns that this is how you walk. That you just make this little motion with a finger, and that's what will propel your body through this world. And how do you run? Well, you make a slightly dip, maybe you press down with this finger and then this finger. So your mind is learning this entire new cyber body in the game world. And I would suggest for further research that what kinds of games would we expect to generate the most powerful kind of cybernetic feedback loop that would most quickly help you to adopt a new cybernetic body as your own? It would probably be a game that's first person, not side-scrolling, because with first person you get a sensory input that more directly mirrors the one that your mind is designed to handle. A game that's real-time, not turn-based, because you want that instantaneous cybernetic feedback loop. A game that provides sensory input via multiple sensory organs, so that it's helping to train your brain in many different sensory modes at once. So through visual input, this is a design for a suit that sends electric shocks to your entire body to make you feel the sensation of pressure. Also, if the game is able to receive input from many different ways, then that's also going to give your mind more ways of training itself to use this new cyber body. So what are the ramifications of all of this? The effects of adopting non-human bodies are not yet well understood. Probably this is going to create both opportunities and problems. What would the ramifications be if, using neuroprosthetics, people were able to adopt new cybernetic bodies on a long-term or permanent basis? This is an area that ethicists and engineers are starting to think about, but science fiction writers and game creators are so far ahead of them that they have already been thinking about all of these issues for decades, and that they really have blazed the trail and given so much for the ethicists and engineers to now start working on to try and catch up. So what are the things that researchers now actually have to look at as neuroprosthetic devices are becoming more complex? They're the kinds of things that have been themes in science fiction works for a long time. Issues like losing the ability to distinguish between reality and virtuality, if you're spending all of your time in a virtual body, losing the ability to master one's real physical body, dependence on or even addiction to a cybernetic body that could result in physical harm to your natural physical body, the fact that you could be subject to identity theft, blackmail, manipulation, all sorts of problems at the hands of people who know how to hack into and control these technological systems, which are now mediating your most intimate and basic interaction with your own body. Due to the close integration with the brain's neural circuitry and the strong cybernetic feedback loop, it's not inconceivable that some kinds of damage or injury suffered to one's game body in the cybernetic system could have some kind of physical or psychological effects on one's real-world body, as has been depicted in films like Avalon, where you had characters playing illegal virtual reality video games. Or like in Shadowrun, where if you jack out of cyberspace, it can leave you stunned and disoriented. that's a real issue that now engineers and ethicists will have to start looking at. So what are these psychological, social, political, artistic, ethical, aesthetic implications that we should be looking at? One way that we can start to look at those questions today is by playing video games and studying and reflecting on that experience. Gamers and game designers are pioneers operating at the frontiers of body schema re-engineering. That they're providing us with data and insights into the limits of how fast and how far the human body can be transformed before the human mind reaches its inherent limits. So gamers are not simply simulating body transformation, they are actually accomplishing it. And a final general question to leave you with, or for us all to consider, is do game designers realize the extent to which the choices that they make regarding things like the design of the game world, storyline, character design, if you're designing this immersive virtual reality game and you were debating whether to make the player character's robot body have 4 legs or 12 legs, you probably didn't realize, or you may not have considered, the impact that that decision will actually have on transforming the player's body. All of those decisions being made by game designers are influencing the new cyber bodies that are being created for the players who are playing their games. So I have some summary slides, but we can skip over those. Basically, they just summarize the different sections that we went through. Oh, thank you. Bardzo dziękuję.